In this video, we will talk about poor comprehenders. That is, children who have difficulty understanding what they read. If we recall the simple view of reading and the classification of reading difficulties based on that rough distinction into two dimensions, we will remember that poor comprehenders occupied this quadrant, which is associated with good word recognition and poor listening comprehension. So poor comprehenders are those who can decode but cannot understand, but have difficulty understanding. When we talk about comprehension difficulties, the first thing that we must have in mind is that they're different from decoding difficulties. So a dyslexic, a person with dyslexia, is someone who has word level difficulties, has difficulties with word level processing that are seen in word accuracy and fluency. In general, all sorts of decoding tests, could be pseudo word decoding, or it could be other sorts of orthographic tests. In contrast, poor comprehenders may have no difficulty with reading accurately, but cannot understand sufficiently well compared to their grade level. So there are two different kinds of problems, which also means that it is possible to have both kinds of problems. And that is not a different kind, it's just a co-occurrence. So it is possible to have difficulty both with decoding and with comprehension. Comprehension difficulties and their behavioral manifestation are not homogeneous. That is to say, not all children who have comprehension difficulties behave the same or perform the same when they have to deal with written text. One distinction that has been made in the literature, it is not the only one, has to do with so-called explorers versus plotters. And this has to do with the extent to which someone with difficulties understanding a text tries to work with the text versus trying to bring in other information from outside the text. So someone who works with the text may be making the wrong connections or deriving the wrong information from the text. Someone who tries to go beyond the text may bring on irrelevant information from background knowledge that doesn't contribute to global coherence. So there are different ways to fail to understand by building inappropriate situation models. One issue that comes up also in the context of comprehension difficulties has to do with fluency, and in particular with the relationship between fluency and comprehension. These two things are related, which means that someone who doesn't understand written passages very well is also likely to be reading those passages non-fluently. Indeed, a poor comprehender is not very likely to be a very fluent reader. However, this doesn't mean that these two are intimately or directly linked. For one thing, if we look at the opposite kind of difficulty, those who are disfluent because of word level problems, that is, children with dyslexia, have no primary comprehension difficulties. So someone who has difficulties with decoding may have no difficulty with understanding per se. They may be able to understand an oral story perfectly, and they may be able to understand a paragraph of written text perfectly if they don't get too tired trying to read it, or if they don't forget the beginning before they reach the end. So there is no primary comprehension problem associated with disfluent reading. So looking at the poor comprehenders, it's not clear exactly why there are concomitant effects on reduced fluency. This may have to do with the dependence of prosody on understanding, with the importance of attention for both word level and text level processing, or with measurement issues having to do with what is easiest and most reliable to measure. So these two things are indeed related when measured, but this does not mean that there is a direct link. Vocabulary is also strongly correlated with comprehension, indeed more strongly than reading fluency. And that is true both concurrently, so when they're both measured at the same time, and also longitudinally. When you're trying to predict reading comprehension, the first thing you can measure is reading comprehension, of course, but other than that, the best option is to measure vocabulary. So vocabulary is strongly related to comprehension. Now, is this a specific or is it a generic link? A specific link would be that vocabulary measures word knowledge, and knowing the specific words in a passage is necessary for understanding the passage. That's a very direct link between vocabulary and comprehension. But vocabulary may also stand as a proxy for language development. So when you measure someone's vocabulary, what you're really measuring is their overall language level, because as your language develops, your vocabulary grows. You can't separate them. This is not a mistake. This just indicates that things go together. So in that sense, your vocabulary measure might stand in as a comprehension measure because both have to do with your level of oral language. It also might be related to a measurement issue in the sense that it is quite reliable to measure vocabulary. So even as a proxy for something else, like listening comprehension, it might be a relatively valid measurement, whereas it's much more demanding to measure reading comprehension because it's such a heterogeneous set of skills that must be brought to bear on a text in order to understand. So the vocabulary difficulties of poor comprehenders are not easily and directly interpretable. To appreciate the heterogeneity of comprehension problems, it is useful to think once again of what is necessary in order for reading comprehension to be successful. So what are the things one must do in order to understand a passage? The first and obvious thing is to understand the words, to know the words, to access their meanings, so to have a sufficient vocabulary. The second thing one must be able to do is to understand sentences in the sense of combining the sentence structure. Well, first of all, detecting the sentence structure, and then combining it with word meaning to reach a meaning of a sentence. Then one must be able to link sentences by joining what is common between them and by representing the relations, at least the explicit ones. So when there are connectives indicating spatial, temporal, or causal relations, this has to be processed. Inferences must be generated all the time. That includes necessary inferences that must be generated in order for the sentences to be linked appropriately, and also elaborative inferences, which generate further implied information that may be useful further down during passage reading. This is one more thing someone must be able to do, generate the appropriate inferences. And then being able to integrate the meaning of all the sentences plus the generated inferences such that the whole makes sense and does not include inconsistencies or conflicts. And then someone has to check that there aren't any inconsistencies or conflicts by monitoring the comprehension in case revisions are necessary. This is a metacognitive skill that is also involved in reading comprehension. Having and using background knowledge is very important in reading comprehension. That's because texts do not mention things that everybody knows. But the fact that everybody knows these things does not mean that it is very simple to activate them when they're needed. We all know very many different things. What we must do as we read the passage is we must choose among this vast reservoir of knowledge to activate and retrieve the knowledge that is relevant at this point and useful for understanding this passage. So it's not enough to know stuff. You have to be able to identify and retrieve the right piece that will correctly link to the text you're reading. You also need to know about text structures so that you can use your knowledge of these structures in order to generate appropriate expectations and inferences, so that you know what you're looking for and what you need to supply if that's not there. Different kinds of texts have different structures and therefore should lead to different expectations and generation of different kinds of information. And finally, one must be able to remember. One must be able to remember the things that one reads in the text and the representations one forms on the basis of those, including the contributed information, so the generated inferences and the retrieved background knowledge. So all of these things must work for reading comprehension to work. This means that any of these could be a weak link. You could be a poor comprehender by failing in one or more of those. And there may be as many kinds of poor comprehenders as there are different combinations of these kinds of skills, to the extent that these can be separable. But they're obviously not one and the same thing. So it's clearly possible to be a poor comprehender in many different ways. So what are poor comprehenders? By means of definition, a poor comprehender is someone who exhibits poor reading comprehension and accurate decoding. So they can read words accurately. Note, we don't say fluently. It's not likely that a poor comprehender will be very fluent. I suppose it's possible, especially with easy texts that do not make very heavy demands on prosodic requirements, but in general, a poor comprehender is not defined on the basis of fluency, but accuracy. That also makes a lot of sense because once someone is an accurate decoder, this is sufficient evidence that this person is recognizing the words from the page. So the person is actually getting the words in. They're lifting the words from the page into their minds. So they have the words, and if they know the words, then they know the meanings of the words. Why aren't they understanding? Well, something else must not be functioning properly. So that's the definition of a poor comprehender when it is considered a specific difficulty. So in the absence of other types of problems related to reading. This does not mean that one cannot be both a poor comprehender and a poor decoder, but in research, when we study poor comprehenders, we select poor comprehenders who are only poor comprehenders because we want to understand specifically what is associated with poor comprehension. So here we should make a distinction. In the field, it is quite possible that a child might have difficulties both at the word level and at text level. So a child might have difficulties both with decoding, accuracy or fluency, and with comprehension. So when you say that someone has comprehension problems out in the field, this doesn't imply anything about their decoding. That may be good or may not be good. When you read a research article that specifically mentions poor comprehenders, it is almost certain that they talk about specific poor comprehenders. So they talk about this definition here. They talk about kids who have difficulty understanding, although they're accurate decoders. And that's because you want to specifically understand what goes into comprehension. So keep that distinction in mind, that this definition here is not about the field work. It's about the research and the articles that you read about comprehension. So why is one a poor comprehender? Well, one can be potentially weak in one or more of those skills that we mentioned before. All of these things that must happen for comprehension to be successful, they're all possibly things that can go wrong. This means that it is possible to be a poor comprehender in some cases, even when your verbal memory is fine and your vocabulary is normal. Usually, poor comprehension is associated with poor vocabulary. And that may have to do also with the fact that the relationship between reading and vocabulary at some point becomes bidirectional. This means that you learn words by reading. If you don't understand what you read, you are essentially one kind of poor reader. You're not likely to read very much, and you aren't likely to learn more words by reading, because to learn words by reading requires you to understand the text. Indeed, to learn new words by reading requires you to understand the text so well that you can infer the meanings of the new words. If you're not good at understanding text, you are not going to be good at learning new words. So you're not going to have a high vocabulary. So it is unlikely that very poor reading comprehension will be associated with a high vocabulary, as children must rely on oral language to learn vocabulary to a higher extent than others. However, it is possible to be a poor comprehender even with vocabulary in the normal range when there are other kinds of problems, so other areas of weaknesses. And that would be more expected in younger ages, where one is not expected to have learned so many words via reading. When it comes to memory, working memory is also associated with comprehension, so poor comprehenders are likely to have reduced working memory skills, especially working memory, not plain short-term memory. So it's not so much the ability that makes you remember and correctly report back a sequence of digits in the same order that is important here, as much as the ability to hold information in your memory and process it at the same time. But still, it's possible that you will be within normal range for working memory and still not understand text well enough at your age level. That's because there's so many different skills that are involved in understanding. So the point here is we're talking about a very heterogeneous population. The thing they have in common is they get low scores on tests of comprehension. So they're not understanding what they're reading very well. That is true. But why they're not understanding it can be very different. And what other kinds of skills they perform low on can be very different. This means that the role of assessment must go beyond the surface. The surface is their comprehension is low, but that doesn't say very much. Why is their comprehension low? You have to assess more specifically which elements of the reading comprehension process are weakest. You have to find those, and then you have to address those. There is no general fix for reading comprehension. What one must do in intervention is one must work specifically on the weak domains and find ways to practice and strengthen those domains that are most in need by specific targeting, practicing, and then taking the skills in the context of the whole comprehension. So specific practice and in context practice, like you have to do with any other skill. So when you identify a reading comprehension problem, you're not done with your assessment. You've just begun with your assessment if you want to try and address these problems. So to sum up, assessment must identify specific weaknesses in the comprehension process, specific domains associated with comprehension that may be deficient, and this must lead to targeted intervention for those domains, practice in isolation and in context, in order to hope to achieve some results with reading comprehension.